I can't see anything that the IRFU did that wasn't absolutely based in reason and going as far as they could to include trans people. Can you?
I mean, okay, my understanding of that what the IRFU did is that in Ireland, that affects two people. Am I right in saying that?
I believe you're correct. Well, no, in fact, no, actually, you're not.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 145 for the 13th of October 2022. So in this podcast we have an interview, I think, but actually it's really half an interview. You'll hear the interviewer, half of it, in a moment. It's with IFA Gallagher of the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, which describes itself as a counter-extremism think tank. And she's written a book that's just been published. It's called Web of Lies. She's also been writing about the topic of trans rights and that debate. And, as you may know, that is a horribly dysfunctional and bitter debate, and it's one that's almost impossible to have on civil terms for a whole load of reasons. But I want to say thank you to Aoife for a couple of things. As you'll hear, Aoife made a great job of addressing the issues that I raised with her, and we really thrashed out some of them, but I actually had 9 typed pages of notes for talking to Aoife, and I only got through a fraction of the questions I had. But I want to thank Aoife for answering in a really constructive way, which, as I say, is really rare in this debate. And as I said, I only got through a fraction of my questions, and that still makes a really long interview, and Aoife had a time constraint, so I also want to thank her for agreeing to come back on the podcast as soon as possible and to do a part 2. We haven't recorded that yet, but we have an appointment to do that, so I hope to bring that to you very soon to continue the discussion. So if you have any questions on this topic that you think should be addressed, please do send it in by email or tweet or by smoke signal or whatever. Probably the easiest way is to email podcast@here'show.ie. I should note also that Kevin was good enough to let me know that I got touch rugby and tag rugby confused. Apologies for that. I hope it doesn't distract from the interview. In a moment we'll have that interview, but I just want to say first thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates. We don't get any huge amount of money out of it, not nearly in the same league as some other major Irish podcasters, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster when we get a new patron. It lets us know that there are people out there who listen and who appreciate the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as the donors and throw in the price of a bus ticket once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow @Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Aoife Gallagher is a research analyst with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. It's a counter-extremism think tank. And she's also, I have to say, congratulations, Aoife. You've also published your first book, Web of Lies. That's out on the 6th of October from Gill Books. But I got in touch with you because I was interested in an article you were writing about trans rights issues in the journal.ie, and I see that you had an article under the heading Trans Rights Issues Are Being Used as a Right-Wing Recruitment Tool. I know that sort of touches on the content of your book, but I just want to get a couple of things straight first, and sometimes I'm coming from a position of ignorance on this. I know trans seems to be short for something. What is it short for exactly? Is it short for transsexual or transgender? What's the kind of accepted vocabulary there?
Yeah, I suppose people used to say transsexual, but now it's more about transgender. And, you know, we can get into maybe a little bit later the differences between sex and gender, which is a big part really of this discussion. But yeah, transgender is the main phrase. That's what's the main thing that's in discussion these days. And that phenomena,
transgender or trans or whatever. As you understand it, I've seen it like referred to as different things, everything from like an innate quality of the person to a mental illness to a reaction against society's gender expectations. As you understand it, what is it exactly?
My understanding of it is that it is an innate quality of someone, that someone is born transgender. Yeah.
Okay. And then you've been writing about conspiracy theorists taking an interest in this debate. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I suppose, okay, the way to explain this, I suppose, is I tend to frame this in terms of the pandemic, because the pandemic was such a huge moment for the kind of coalescing of a lot of disparate online movements, right? Mm-hmm. So kind of before the pandemic, you had the likes of the anti-vaccine movement, you had the kind of, right-wing extremist movements, you had, anti-5G movements, you had conspiracy movements like QAnon, and for the most part, they all kind of stuck to their own kind of corners of the internet, kind of as a way to put it, and kind of stuck to their own ideologies and pushing their own belief systems, right? Mm-hmm. But the pandemic really brought all these movements together. They all started talking and pushing back against COVID restrictions and kind of spreading conspiracy theories really about COVID-19 and the pandemic. So what this means in an online context really is that all of these different communities are now part of the same kind of ecosystem, I suppose, is a way to kind of think about it online. Mm-hmm. So the communities that have been set up since the pandemic have all of these things involved in it. They have a bit of far-right extremism, they have a bit of QAnon, they have a bit of anti-vaccine stuff, and they kind of, so now what we kind of talk about is more of a hybridized conspiratorial force. And really, since the pandemic, the pandemic is obviously still ongoing and all the rest, but really I suppose the conspiracy theorists have changed tack, I suppose, since the restrictions ended and things like that. And what they have turned their attention to is anti-LGBT campaigning, and really anti-trans issues have become the real hot button topic in the middle of this. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of different reasons for this as well. And I kind of, I have an entire chapter in the book that's titled The Children, because the children are always used within these movements as a means to generate fear in order to pull people into a certain way of thinking. And they've been the subject of moral panics for essentially centuries, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think about something like QAnon, and for people who don't know, anything about QAnon, I'll give you a very, very quick description of it. It is a really, really lurid and complicated conspiracy theory movement that essentially ties in a lot of different conspiracy theories. But the main theme within QAnon is the idea that Donald Trump, during his presidency, and still now, is saving the world from an elite group of child trafficking pedophiles, right? That is the main kind of theme within QAnon. That's what a lot of QAnon believers believe. Mm-hmm. And this idea that the world has been run by an elite group of pedophiles is really easily translated into the kind of old tropes that used to be thrown against the LGBT community, and mainly gay men, that gay people are child abusers, that they are pedophiles. And this is warped into what is really termed groomer rhetoric. And, anyone who spends time in right-wing circles online will be aware of this, because this is how it's been framed now. People who, say, teachers who are teaching children about, LGBT inclusive issues, or LGBT people, or teaching children about gender identity, are being branded as groomers, people who are grooming and indoctrinating children into a certain way of thinking. And anti-trans issues have, as I said, they've become the hot button topic. And I think there's a couple of different reasons for that, really. And I go into this in the journal piece as well. The anti-trans, like, I've been looking at the kind of darkest parts of the internet for, 5 or 6 years at this stage.
God bless you.
What I've really seen, yeah, I know, yeah, it's some job. And within, communities like, or sites like 4chan, again, I go into this in quite a bit of detail in the book, and kind of explaining the kind of cultures of 4chan, but it's really one of the main communities that spawned the alt-right. Mm-hmm. And a lot
for people, I'm going to stop you for a second, Aoife, because some people will not be so familiar with those. So there are message boards or forums, which are essentially websites just full of different people writing their opinions, be it in one line like a Twitter, or be it pages of stuff. 4chan was a particularly anarchic, particularly troublesome version of that, where the type of content on it was designed to shock, and it seemed like, basically 13-year-olds let run wild. Although it was the place where, for example, QAnon and some of these other very wild conspiracy theories were spawned.
Exactly. Yeah. That's not a bad description. Well done. But a lot of the culture of places like 4chan is also based around trolling and online abuse and harassment campaigns. And a lot of it is geared towards targeting minorities or marginalized people. And for years, trans people have been a huge target of this. Trans people, especially that have a public profile or who tend to be, to kind of put their head above the parapet, I suppose, and kind of put themselves out there online, are constantly.
Yeah. So what you'd have is somebody would say this trans person or this gay person or whatever we don't like for X, Y, and Z reason, and they would en masse they would suggest to the various readers of this forum to en masse descend and launch a hate campaign against them on Twitter, or perhaps more serious stuff. Occasionally this has happened. Has been what's been called swatting, which is a fairly sophisticated, although not always all that sophisticated way to essentially fake an emergency call from somebody's house, where in fact there is not only no emergency but also no call coming from that house. Trick very militarized police into thinking that somebody's being held hostage there, and they break in the door, and this is regarded as a great joke. And this has been done then to other victims who are not in on that forum, and other targeting as well.
Yes, exactly. I mean, swatting is one of the big tactics, and it's becoming more popular all the time. I think it's kind of, you hear more and more stories of this happening. And the other thing that, you would have, rape threats, death threats, doxing as well is another one where like personal information is leaked online. So say your phone number or your address. And so
somebody posts your phone number and all of a sudden you're getting 1,000 calls a day, abusive calls or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. These things can destroy people's lives. This is, it's people think, oh, it's happening online, it's not a big deal, but it's absolutely is a big deal.
Okay. And that's very much a subculture, both that online stuff and how it kind of came offline with perhaps anti-lockdown protests, the more marginal ones of those and so forth. But I think one thing that you've been monitoring is that not necessarily those exact tactics, but the content has been moving into much more mainstream, let's say, right-wing media.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, a lot of this comes from the States, right? And, I used to say, a couple of years ago, what happens in the States eventually comes to this side of the world a few years later. But actually that period of time is shortening all the time. Yeah. And really, if you see something kind of bubbling up in these kind of communities in the States, you can be pretty sure it'll be actually bubbling up in Irish communities at the same time. And really, again, what I've seen over the space of a few years is that these kind of, I suppose the rhetoric and the kind of hate campaigns that have been kind of launched in places like 4chan are now being broadcast on places like Fox News. Like Fox News Tucker Carlson show is one of the big, I think it might be the highest watched
we have,
show.
It is the highest watched news show in the US, you're correct. We have to just be careful on that. So Tucker Carlson is not advocating people being swatted or doxing people's private information being published online, but he is using arguments that essentially originated in these very extreme forums.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose another big,
can you give an example of that?
We see as well. Well, I suppose what I could say instead really is that another trend that we see is that, very fringe stories, very kind of, maybe a trans person doing something that the vast majority of people and other trans people would consider beyond the pale is being broadcast on episodes of things like Fox News or things like Tucker Carlson as a trend that is widespread, right? So it means that and it's kind of been broadcast as a trend that liberals see as acceptable, right? And this is kind of the tactic that they use a lot of the time, is kind of framing, I suppose, kind of marginalized people as an example of what the liberals want to make mainstream, right? So that really is kind of a big part of this as well. I suppose another example that I can give is there's a number of, I suppose, social media accounts online that are also using this tactic. You know, they'll kind of copy people's videos from other platforms, namely TikTok seems to be the one that a lot of these videos are copied from. So say, for example, you have a trans or a non-binary person who is just speaking about, you know, maybe they're transitioning, or they're speaking about trying to kind of, you know, push for more acceptance and kind of and tolerance in kind of everyday life. These videos will be copied and they will be framed within these kind of social media accounts and these kind of platforms as, again, an example of the Liberals are crazy. This is what they want. They want this for your children. This is, you know, that they want to...
And I think what's being done is the very most extreme examples are being plucked out and presented as the being representative of the mass. And that's not entirely new. I made the point in this podcast previously that if you compare maybe two, sort of a fairly left-wing website like Huffington Post in the US and a very right-wing one like Breitbart, and basically on Breitbart, no immigrant can do so much as get a parking ticket without it being, highlighted as, immigrants causing crime wave. And equally, no child of an immigrant can so much as get, a gold star on her homework in school. And this will be, highlighted on Huffington Post as, a heartwarming story. And that has the effect of framing of essentially giving people a frame of reference. So if you read more or less exclusively one or other of those sources, you're going to get an entirely different impression of that issue. My question is, aside from that, because what we tried to do in this podcast is the exact reverse of that, is to try to have a calm discussion about things. In mainstream media, that could not be tarred with the Fox News brush and so forth. There have been people who disagree with, what might be the orthodox accepted trans rights view. Would you accept that there are plenty of people there who are not alone are they not 4chan types, they don't have any bad intent. There are people who are genuinely concerned about the issue, who disagree with, positions put forth perhaps by TENI, the Trans Equality Network. I presume you don't disagree that there are people there who can make those points and they shouldn't be tarred with that brush.
No, of course. And I think that there is, this conversation online is so heated. Do you know what I mean? You can't really have a conversation about this topic online without both sides really being extremely hateful towards each other. And I think that's a bigger issue really. That's kind of just the way that social media has kind of, warped, I suppose, our sense of reality and kind of our kind of good conversations about things. And yes, you are right. Okay. There are certain issues related to transgender issues and transgender rights that do need to be discussed, right? And I think that, particular hot button topics are the use of puberty blockers on kids, and the, I suppose, young children kind of being socially transitioned and things like that. But again, what a lot of what you see within the kind of, the right-wing media ecosystem is perpetuating kind of fears about this that really aren't based on reality, right? And a lot of this, say, for example, people will say that children are being, trans children are being sent for surgeries and things like that at very young ages. And that is not true for the most part. Now, I'm not saying that this never, ever happens, but for the most part, no one will go for surgery until they are 18 years old, until they are an adult. So the idea that kids are being sent for surgeries like this is just not true. Also, well,
I'm going to, because I've done a lot of research to this and I want to be kind of very careful on this. That is certainly very unusual. But that has happened. That has happened. And one, in fact, Irish surgeon based in Boston who markets her surgery over TikTok, which I think is quite strange, and has said that she has performed essentially a double mastectomy on girls. And she said they're almost always over 16, but has done this to girls as young as 13. People get quite concerned about that, and people of good intention who are not being sucked into a wild conspiracy theory world. People of good intention have concerns about that. But I just want to go back to one thing you said in your article in the Journal in particular. We just want to start with that, because unfortunately, not only the views on this, not only the opinions on this, but even the facts on this can be, highly contested. And one of the things you said in your article was, you say, the majority of people are assigned either male or female at birth, based on presence of certain genitalia. But approximately 1.7% of the world's population are born intersex, almost equal to the number of people with red hair. I've looked into that very carefully. That 1.7, you seem to be taking that from a study by a woman called Dr. Anne Fausto Sterling. So 1.7 is about one person in 60. And that figure of people who are intersex, which is entirely different, it's not the same thing at all to people who are trans.
No, it is different.
Yeah, it's a completely separate thing, which you acknowledge. Of course, I understand that. I just want to clarify that for the listeners. But that number of 1 in 60 is got by adding up people with more than 20 different conditions. But the overwhelming majority of the people in that 1.7% are people with a condition called late onset congenital adrenal hyplasia, which is a hormonal disorder. But people with that disorder are unambiguously male or female. And later researchers took up that issue. They took issue with that number, and Dr. Fausto Sterling acknowledged, and from reading what she said, she seems to have accepted those criticisms. And the previously generally accepted definition of intersex, which would typically be people born with what you might call a birth defect, where it is not clear what whether their genitals are male or female. That's something between, depending on how you measure it, between 1 in 2,000 and 1 in 5,000. And I note that the subheading on your article on the Journal says, IFA Gallagher argues that anti-trans campaigners do not have science on their side, no matter how hard they try. When you say that, you have to kind of be careful to make sure you have the science right yourself. Can you see how some people who are uneasy about things like that see that and could view that as a motivated reading of the facts, that you are going for this 1.7 figure because it is by far and away the largest figure that has ever been suggested for that, and it's not a very well supported one in science?
Yeah, okay. I'm actually glad you asked me this question, okay, because it was kind of probably the biggest piece of feedback, I suppose, that I got from the article, right? And I suppose my understanding of it is that 1.7%, or the kind of the definition of intersex, is fairly fluid, as far as I know, and that different conditions can be included in being intersex and other. That's true. Okay.
But that particular condition, late onset congenital adrenal hyplasia, which accounts for 90% of the people in that 1.7%. There's no fluidity in that. That is simply not intersex and has never been accepted as such.
Okay. Well, I'll definitely take that point. Okay. But I guess the reason, and I do think, to be honest, if I was going to go back and write that article again, I probably would add that context into it, because I really, I am not in this job to try and inflate things that in that kind of a way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and anybody involved in research or science, by far the proudest thing they should ever be able to say is that I got it wrong, because that means that you can acknowledge things, and that's how we learn. So I don't want you to take that as a personal criticism at all. But go ahead and reply to that.
Definitely not. But yeah, exactly. So I do think that I would probably go back and kind of tweak that and add that little bit of extra context in there. But I suppose the reason that I mentioned that at all is because a lot of the replies that you'll get to people talking about transgender issues online is that biology is set. Biology is male, biology is female. There is no in between, and that is it. And essentially what I wanted to do with that point is to say, actually, no, there is an in between. There are people that are neither one or the other, that have these conditions, that you cannot say that people are biologically male, biologically female, and that is it, set in stone. So that was really the point I wanted to make. I will take your point that that number, that there is a lot of controversy surrounding that number, and I will say that I probably would tweak that, I think, if I was to go back to do it.
Okay, well that's a proud thing to say. I want to just play you a very, very brief clip from a guy called Owen Hercombe. He labels himself as the first non-binary mayor in the UK. He's mayor of a town in Wales, and he was interviewed by the BBC, and he said this:
"That's not what being male means. I mean, there are lots of different ways of being lots of different things, and some men do have penises and some men don't, and it's not about that. I mean, to define gender as, do you have the capability of getting pregnant, or as some people do you sit down or stand up to pee, is just ridiculous. It's so much more complicated than that."
I guess what I want to ask you is, there are people who react against that. And I wonder, and I want to give you a bit more information, but I wonder whether you accept that people who react against that are doing so in good faith and perhaps with good grounds. And if I was to ask you, are humans a bipedal species? Are humans a species with two legs? You wouldn't have any difficulty to saying that humans and ostriches and a few others are bipedal species. And equally, humans and some others have been understood to be a sexually dimorphic species. Sexually dimorphic basically means that the males aren't the same as the females. So ducks are sexually dimorphic. Females are brown, males are green. Swans are not sexually dimorphic. You can't really tell by looking at a swan whether they're male or female. The point there that I'm trying to make with that is that you may at the edge get some people who, for accident of birth or calamity, end up with not having two legs. But that doesn't undermine the general truth that humans are a bipedal species. And that's not to undermine or to belittle the existence of people who don't fit exactly into one category or the other. But humans are a sexually dimorphic species. The overwhelming majority, in the same way as the overwhelming majority have two legs, the overwhelming majority are very clearly either male or female. And that way that Owen Hercombe puts it, and just says that, oh, well, some men have penises, some men don't, some women have vaginas, some women don't. You can understand why he says that, and that's kind of part of his identity, and that's sort of important to him. But that's not a scientific statement of the facts, is it?
I suppose it depends if he's talking about sex or gender, right? And I kind of, said this at the start. There is a difference between sex and gender, and sex is more based on biology, and gender is now agreed upon by a wide range of different people studying in this field, that gender is a spectrum. It is not a binary thing between male and female, and that gender comes from, it is both a kind of nature and nurture. There's both of these things going on, right? So a part of it is based on your biology, but a part of it is also based on the society you grow up in and the kind of gender roles that are, I suppose, a part of the lives that we grow up in, right? And I'd say that is pretty well agreed upon. So I think it depends there if he's talking about, male sex or male gender, right? And I would say that he's talking about gender, right? Now I can agree that if someone hearing something like that and framed it the way that he said it, I understand it, right? I understand that people are like, what God?
But you and I and we have an intelligent listenership on this podcast. It's people who are going for a very specific type of debate. It's not fire brigade type rushing to the latest news headlines. But there's a wide range of people. I would say the vast majority of the population who are hearing that are at best rolling their eyes and at worst thinking this guy it could be dangerous.
I wouldn't say dangerous. I think that might be a bit far, but
but people could think that. I don't think Owen Hercombe is dangerous, by the way. But people could be in genuine and not ill-founded fear.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the biggest issues with this entire conversation about gender, trans, and non-binary people is that, so say, for example, the push for LGBTQ rights, or the push for gay rights, let's put it as gay rights, through the past, 30, 40 years, whatever it is, has come to a point now that people are accepting of gay people and lesbian people and bisexual people, right? Because most people know someone who is gay or lesbian or bisexual, right?
Everyone knows someone who's gay. They might not know that they know.
Exactly, right? Exactly.
But they mostly know that they know now.
In their life. Exactly. And they are suddenly, I'm sorry, I am also saying this as a gay woman. Okay. So they are now, like, people are aware that gay people are not a danger to society. They just want to be accepted for who they are. Right. Mm-hmm. What we have now is that trans and non-binary people are a tiny minority of people. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of people
to put it in context, I want just to put that in context. Gender recognition certificates have been available in Ireland since 2015. There's about 1,000 have been issued in total, presuming that none of those people have died since. That would be less than 1 in 5,000 of the population. So it will be even below that very lowest threshold of the count of intersex people. So it is really a very, very small minority. Go ahead, sorry.
Exactly, yes. So the vast majority of people don't know someone who is trans or non-binary. And I'll give you an example from my own life. I had a friend that came out as trans last year. And to me, having someone in my life that is going through something like that made all these issues so much easier to understand. And it's not like, because they're not complicated. When you actually talk to someone about it and someone who's going through it, it becomes really, really easy to understand. And I think that is what is missing a lot from all of these conversations online, is actually trying to understand the issues that are related to these people. They are extremely marginalized. They're extremely vulnerable. And the fact that they are being used as a whipping pole, essentially, by all of these groups to try and again, a lot of this is being spurred on.
So essentially what's happening is that, perhaps speaking for the US, Ireland is perhaps not exactly the same, but it's not entirely different, that for a very significant chunk of the population, their only experience of trans people is via Fox News.
Yeah, or via whatever they're seeing online. For the most part, those conversations online are pivoted to the extreme, right?
Okay, but pause on that. So people like, and we have trans advocates in Ireland who are pretty articulate, and they have pretty good access to the media. Wouldn't it be better if they were an awful lot more careful with their language, rather than just doing this hand waving thing of saying some women have penises, some women have vaginas?
I don't know. I think I kind of take a little bit of, I kind of get where you're coming from, but I think I take a little bit of an issue with that as well, because I think that they need to own the language. They're talking about their own issues, and they need to be able to say it from their place.
I don't want to get too stuck on that issue, because a few other things that I want to ask you about, and I want to make sure that you get to say your piece on them. And a few months back, there was an issue with the IRFU, the Irish Rugby Football Union, and they updated their policies to reflect trans inclusion in rugby, which is a pretty active and sometimes violent game. And they decided that for women's rugby, trans women, that's to say males who have transitioned either medically or socially to be women, trans women could participate in women's rugby as coaches, as referees, and take part in tag rugby, which is where you don't tackle, where you just like touch the person. That's considered that you have done a successful tackle if you just like put your hand on them. But that for full contact rugby, trans women, that's to say men who have transitioned to be women, can't take part in full contact rugby on women's teams. And this was the subject of incredibly sharp criticism that came from TENI, the Trans Equality Network, also from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and from people of varying influence on social media. I saw comments, and not from tiny accounts, from significant accounts, saying that the IRFU decision was, quote, motivated by nothing but bigotry. The IRFU was called a hate group. And one person who I actually communicated on Twitter with, Bernie Lan, she's a fairly prominent campaigner, she posted a video of Peter Stringer, who is quite a small rugby player, tackling Jonah Lomu, who is a huge rugby player. And the clear intent of that was to say that physical size doesn't matter when it comes to players in rugby. That's simply untrue. I can't see anything that the IRFU did that wasn't absolutely based in reason and going as far as they could to include trans people. Can you?
I mean, okay, my understanding of that what the IRFU did is that in Ireland, that affects two people. Am I right in saying that?
I believe you're correct. Well, no, in fact, no, actually, you're not. Because
okay,
in Ireland, there are two trans women that's to say men who transition to be women, involved in playing rugby. But it affects everyone who plays women's rugby. And it also affects all trans women who may start playing rugby and all women who may start playing rugby. So you're correct in, the basis of what you're saying is of course correct. There are 2 trans women playing rugby under the IRFU, but of course that does affect a lot more people.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of debate around trans people in sports is definitely one that, I mean, I don't think I have a good answer to this, to be honest.
No, I'm not asking for an answer on that. Sorry, Aoife. I'm not asking you for an answer on the thing. You're not an expert on that. But most of it is still online. There was an avalanche of hate rained down on the IRFU for making a decision that I cannot see has anything but reason behind it.
Well, I mean, I don't agree that that's all reason. I do think that a lot of that is bowing to the pressure of other organisations that are doing the same thing. Again, I'll go back to the point that trans people are a tiny minority of people, right? A tiny minority of people. How many trans people play sports? That is a minority of a minority of people. How many trans people are going to be elite athletes? That is a minority of a minority of a minority.
I think you're touching on a different topic, which I think is perhaps not so interesting in terms of fairness in competing. And I'm not so much into that. I'm just talking about pure safety. And the bottom line is that somebody who has gone through male puberty has bigger, harder, more dense bones, has bigger heart, bigger lungs, and so forth. And if you run into them, you will be hit that much harder. And it's just not safe, however they identify, for someone with a male body to play on a women's rugby team. You are putting those, and that's why I say it's not just affecting 2 people. It's affecting all the women who play rugby because it would not be safe for them to play rugby.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know if I fully agree with you, to be honest, on that. And I kind of take Bernie Linan's
Well,
point.
The IRFU took a lot of advice on this. So I'm not saying that it's not safe. It's the IRFU and the experts who they consulted with said it isn't safe.
Yeah, but again, I think issuing a ban like that against...
It's not a ban. It's not a ban.
The
only thing, it's not a ban because trans women were not excluded. The only exclusion was that they weren't allowed to take part in full contact rugby with women. So they could play.
Well, I mean, that is a ban. That is, I mean, if you have
in that narrow sense, it is.
Cannot play rugby. So that is.
No, not correct. No. Sorry, because trans women, that is to say, people with male body, are allowed to play on the male team.
Yeah, but they're
not being banned.
Males. Do you know what I mean? Again, this kind
of... Hold on. No. They are. You may say they are trans women, but their body is a male body.
But when you are transitioning to become a woman, you are taking hormones that will reduce your muscle mass. There are you know what I mean? There are things like that. I don't know the exact science behind it. But the
IRFU did study that, and that is a debate I don't want to get into in terms of fairness of competition. But I'm just focusing on safety here. The IRFU most certainly did study that, and so just to illustrate that, Bernie Linan and a few other people in one particular Twitter thread posted a picture of Peter Stringer. Now, Peter Stringer is 1.71 meters tall. That's to say he is 25 centimetres. That's nearly a foot shorter than Jonah Lomu. And the picture of Peter Stringer with other rugby players, it's obviously cropped for comic effect because Peter Stringer barely comes up, it in fact doesn't even come up to the shoulder of the other players. And the intent of posting that was very obviously to say, well, if somebody who's much smaller, a male who's much smaller, can safely play on a male team, then surely males can play with women. However, I think they didn't realize that it was making the opposite point because Peter Stringer, at 171 centimetres, who is remarkably short for a rugby player, he is still taller than 92% of women. And he is 73 kilos, but because of the male puberty he went through, a lot more of that 73 kilos is muscle. And with the greatest respect to you, Aoife, if you bumped into a 60 kilo woman on the street, you might be knocked down or whatever. If you bump into a 73 kilo very muscular man on the street, that would be an entirely different experience. And Peter Stringer has been playing rugby for a very long time. He knows, since he was a boy, literally, he knows how to do that. He plays in as a scrum half, which is a position that's very appropriate for a much smaller person, somebody who's much smaller than the rest of the team. And he's made the choice to play against teams that have guys who are much bigger than him. Women who play women's rugby have never made a choice to play against male-bodied people, however they identify, and they would not be safe to do so. And I just can't see how that, you and I could debate that, and neither you or I are an expert on that. But to be able to say that the IRFU was motivated by nothing but bigotry and calling the IRFU a hate group.
Yeah, that's wrong. I mean, there's no, we don't even have to debate that. I think that is an extreme reaction to something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of those conversations online just take, like, either side go to an extreme, and that is not in any way conducive to how you have a proper conversation about anything, right?
That's my point. I think we made progress on that. We made progress on that.
Exactly.
But
I don't think they were motivated by hate, but I do think that issuing those kind of sanctions against a tiny minority of people it's not in any way
sanction.
Beneficial to how well it's not. I mean, but issuing anything like that against a tiny minority of people like that is not in any. I don't think that should be the answer to how we deal with whether trans women should play in contact sports like that. I just don't think that.
Okay, fair enough. Rugby is segregated by sex and has always been since there existed rugby for both sexes. To the extent that it could be either segregated by sex or by gender, and you drew a distinction between those two, even if the distinction is slight. If segregating it by sex constitutes discrimination, how is that any more or less discriminatory than segregating it by gender?
I don't know if I fully understand. So you're saying that if you, instead of dividing sports along the lines of sex, you divide it along the lines of gender. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
So you could divide. You could not divide it at all, which would mean that rugby would be 100% male, because then women couldn't play, and then they perhaps would set up their own team, and that's in fact what happened. But if it is to be separated, it could rationally be separated by sex or by gender, and I don't see any pressing reason why segregating it by sex is discriminatory when segregating it by gender is not.
I still don't really know if I know what you're getting at, to be honest.
Well, so, you could, because there are some sports, let's say archery, that doesn't make much, I don't know much about archery, but in terms of strength and whatever, it's to do with accuracy. There's no particular, there doesn't seem to be any particular rationale to segregating it at all. Sorry to archers out there if I'm getting that completely wrong. But if it is to be segregated, then it does seem more rational to segregate it by sex than by gender, doesn't it?
Well, I suppose it does. I suppose it does. Okay. But I think that, and that comes back to the difference between sex and gender. And it comes back to understanding gender dysphoria in people. And
absolutely. And you can say that there may well be other areas of life where segregating by gender makes more sense, but this isn't one of them.
Yeah.
And anyway, I'll move on. I want to move on. I want to move on because I don't want to, because there's a whole bunch of things that I want to get through here. And one thing that has, I think, perhaps been what you have mentioned previously of the maybe more extreme views being highlighted in right-wing media and being presented more as mainstream, perhaps more mainstream than they are. I think that's important, but I just want you to listen to two clips. One is from a trans woman who is a YouTuber called Riley J. Dennis.
I want to talk about our other biases. Let's start with trans people. Would you date a trans person? Honestly? Think about it for a second. Okay, got your answer? Well, if you said no, I'm sorry, but that's pretty discriminatory. Some people think they could never date a trans man with a vagina or a trans woman with a penis. But I think that people are more than their genitals. I think that you could feel attraction to someone without knowing what's between their legs. And if you were to say that you're only attracted to people with vaginas or people with penises, it really feels like you're reducing people just to their genitals. My point is, we have implicit biases that we were raised with or that we developed over time, and they can be hard to get rid of. But you can unlearn your own prejudices. It just takes time and conscious effort. The more you work at unlearning your own prejudices, the more you'll be able to see people from these groups as people. Unlearning our own biases doesn't happen overnight, and I don't have a step-by-step instruction guide for you. But I think if you can accept that these prejudices exist in all of us, even you can identify them when they come up and work to change how you think about them.
That's Riley J. Dennis. And I think perhaps just looking at the figures here, she might not be valid to say she's a very marginal figure. She's got a very large following on Twitter and on YouTube and other platforms. And I just want to listen to this other clip, which came from one of the infamous Liveline programs that was broadcast earlier this year. The audio from RT is a bit garbled at the beginning. The caller identifies himself as a single father of a young daughter.
So as I'm with a young teenage daughter who's lesbian. As a lesbian, she was asked a couple of years ago, while she's still navigating through puberty and her sexuality, by a slightly older teenage male who said he identified as a female.
Okay.
Asked her out, and she said no, she wasn't interested, and she was called transphobic and bigoted for this.
So your daughter who is a lesbian, and she was asked out by a transgender man, a man who was identifying...
Teenage boy,
sorry, who was identifying as a female.
Yes.
And
he said he was a lesbian. By saying that she wasn't interested, and she was called transphobic and bigoted. That was what he said to her.
Okay. This is a very live issue. And the one thing that strikes me from this is that anyone who's been a teenage girl, which I presume includes you, notwithstanding the fact that you're gay, anyone who's been a teenage girl will know that some teenage boys will use any sort of bullying or manipulation or moral blackmail to get into their knickers. Would you accept that nobody is under any obligation to have sex with anyone they don't want to? They can give any reason they like, or they can give no reason at all, and no one can second guess that.
Of course. I mean, that's kind of not really up for debate. But I think that with that Liveline clip that you played there, I mean, we don't really know the details, really. And I think, I don't think it would be right to presume that that transgender person is faking being transgender in order to get with girls. I wouldn't, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that...
But be that as it may... And I wasn't aware you were gay before we started the interview, so thanks for clarifying that. But regardless, it does seem that lesbians, who are a tiny minority in our society, are the target of a lot of this pressure. Maybe I'll get you can, if you want, comment on that personally. But, there's never any instance of, for example, a queue of guys queuing up for coppers or, whatever the equivalent nightclub is these days, and having trans women going up to them saying that they have a duty to date them. Do you think that feminists who are saying that they're at the sharp end of the expectation to accommodate trans women, males who have transitioned to be women, do they have something to complain about?
No, I don't, and I can, say that, I suppose, as a lesbian. And I think that a lot of the, I suppose, a lot of the narratives that go around within the kind of, radical feminist space and the kind of the, I suppose the kind of, I suppose the lesbians that will push back against trans issues and things like that comes from the idea that that lesbians are going to become extinct because of trans people, and the idea.
No. I don't want to blur that issue. I'm just talking, specifically. And in her clip, Riley J. Dennis, who is in this category, someone who's male who transitioned to be a woman, she uses language there saying that a lesbian who doesn't want to have a relationship, who doesn't view a trans woman, a man who's transitioned to be a woman, who doesn't view that person as a lesbian is in some way bigoted. And I think the vocabulary she was using is that they need to do a lot of work to overcome their biases.
Yeah, and again, this is another point. It's one that I didn't go into in the journal article because it is quite complicated, is the fact that sexual orientation is different to gender identity.
Yeah.
So they again are two separate things. So and again, it's more about trying to develop an understanding of these issues instead of people just closing themselves off and being like, well, I don't understand it, so that's it. So there are situations where, say, a trans woman will identify as a lesbian, right? And or is a lesbian. A woman who identifies as a trans woman is a lesbian. And that does come down to the fact that, sexual orientation and gender identity are two separate things. Again, it makes to a lot of people, it makes the whole thing quite complicated and hard to get their head around. Do I think that people that turn down trans people, for relationships or, sex or whatever it happens to be, should immediately be called transphobic? Absolutely not. Do you know what I mean?
There are so many ever?
I don't know. I think it depends on the situation. There's definitely instances where, yes, there could be transphobia involved in that scenario. And I do kind of agree with, apologies, the YouTuber's name has
Riley J. Dennis.
Riley J. Dennis, when she says that, and I mean, maybe this is just me coming from, a woke liberal perspective, but I do think that people should be judged on the people that they are, instead, and
our sexual orientation is very, very deeply ingrained. It is, certainly existed long before humanity, and it's required for the continuation of the species. And if you listen to people like Richard Dawkins, you can see how gay people fit into that as well and are sort of important in society. But this notion that lesbians, and again, it's remarkable that it's targeted mostly at lesbians, are under a duty to essentially examine their conscience and work on themselves and contemplate the discrimination that they're doing. That sounds very, very like conversion therapy.
Yeah, no, I don't think I agree with you there. And I have to say, as a lesbian, I have never experienced anything like that. So maybe I don't know that I'm, you know what I mean? I've never, had a conversation with anyone saying that I need to examine my biases about things like that. So I really don't know where that comes from.
Aoife, I really appreciate you answering all my questions, and I think this is an incredibly valuable conversation, and it's I think far more enlightening than an awful lot of the what passes for conversation on this. And I know that I have a limited slot with you and that you have to go really right now. So can we get back on the air and do a two-parter to continue the discussion?
Let's do it, yeah.
Aoife Gallagher, your book, Web of Lies, published by Gill Books, out on the 6th of October. Thank you very much for talking to me, and let's continue in the next podcast.
No problem. Thanks, William.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter, but most of all, tell your friends.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Aoife Gallagher at Aoife Gall, Gall. And get in touch if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show, or more questions for Aoife when she comes back on the podcast. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. As I said, we don't get anything like other Irish podcasters that I could mention, but it pays for things like web hosting. We basically do the podcast for free. But if you could do the same as the current patrons and donate the price of a Dublin bus ticket with the new reduced fare once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.